ice cream.
Yeah,
So,
he's going to be busy for a while. So
yeah.
start.
So I'll introduce you. So it's a pleasure to have Thomas here. Representative Barbara is going to tell us about unitarity bounds in AdS CFT.
Well, yeah, the pleasure is actually mine. I'd like to thank the organizers and Andrew in particular for giving me the opportunity to be here. So yeah, I'll be talking about some work that I've been doing with, well, primarily John Merrill. That's the original reference. And other follow-ups with other people, Tom Faulkner, Juan Cotard, Rob League, and Christoph Ullmann. So let me start with a brief introduction of what AdS CFT is. Just 2 slides of this material. So this is a really broad term that it's it's been used since '98 to talk about the correspondence between 2 different, seemingly completely different creatures. So we have on one side of the duality, we have gravitational theories and anti-de Sitter space. That's the AdS part. And on the other side of the duality, we have conformal field theories. And AdS CFT states that these 2 beasts are actually equivalent. So we'll see how does that go in a more precise way later on, but I just wanted to state that that's the main idea, and just to explain a little bit what's going on in the title. So we have the bulk physics in AdS and anti-de Sitter space, and this dual conformal field theory is supposed to live on the boundary of the CFT, on the boundary of the gravitational field. So what's really impressive about this, one of the most impressive aspects, is that in some particular limit, the bulk physics are classical physics, whereas the theory that lives on the boundary is a quantum field theory. So this is a little bit of a demagogical phrase that Einstein's equations know about quantum field theory. That's something that, at least to me, sounds really tantalizing. So let's see a little bit in more detail how this might be even possible. So let's look at the symmetries in both sides of the duality. So that's the anti-de Sitter line element. It has that form. And you can see that the isometry group of that metric corresponds to the global symmetry group of conformal field theory, which is the group SOG, 2. So at the level of the symmetries, at least at the very, very basic level, this seems to at least make sense. So yeah, this I need to say that this remains as a conjecture, although it's been tested and is passed all the tests so far. And at least to me and to some other people in the community, this is becoming more like a toolbox to understand aspects of quantum field theory using gravitation and vice versa. So what is incredible about this is that we can actually have a precise map or a dictionary, that's the jargon that people use to refer to this, between various objects in each side of the duality. And I think one neat way of putting that in just one equation is that the equation that I wrote there. So we have on the right-hand side the generating function for some operator computed in the conformal field theory, and in some particular limit that is equal to simply the on-shell action evaluated for some boundary condition on the gravitational side. So there's a map between fields in the gravitational side with operators, and a more precise way to say that is that the boundary conditions in the bulk correspond to sources of certain operators that live on the CFT side. So let's look at the simplest possible example. If we have a scalar field in AdS with some given mass, there are in principle 2 dual operators which this field can correspond to in the CFT, and the conformal dimensions are given by that formula in terms of the mass. Note that there's this quantity called m squared BF, that's the Breitel-Dorner-Friedland mass. And it's been known since the 80s that tachyonic masses in AdS are allowed as long as they are not smaller than that value. So this is a really curious geometry which allows you to have negative square masses and the theory is still stable. Well, that's what I just
So
said.
the proofs for generally curved spaces, still Einstein. So this is just flat, conformally flat AdS.
Sorry.
Yeah, but suppose you put a massive theory in a space with a cosmological constant, which was not a maximally symmetric space like this AdS guy here. Then are there versions of the stability proof for that case? Because the original paper was just for when it was really conformally flat.
So I think this holds for any asymptotically AdS spacetime.
Is there a rigorous proof for that, or is it just a level of looking at the positivity of terms in the action? The original proof is representation theoretically. Just check the spectrum.
Yeah, and you need the entire solution to see what the spectrum looks
Whereas
like.
if you had a generally curved space, albeit asymptotically AdS, calculating the spectrum might be hard.
So I think if you think about it in terms of the field theory, the conformal dimensions only depend on the asymptotics, right? So, and if you just demand that the dimensions are real,
right? So then
you get a bound like that.
That much you'll still find the bound, but there's a statement that the energy is bounded below. That's a stronger statement than just saying that this particular quantity is real.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what would happen if you have a CFT or a deformed CFT with imaginary or complex conformal dimensions. Something has to go wrong, I would say.
Well, no, I'm just asking about a bulk which was generally curved but asymptotically AdS.
Is the energy...
Is there an energy theorem that can be proved? Positivity energy theorem. But
for all asymptotically AdS?
Yeah.
I would assume so, but I'm not aware of the paper.
I think it would be much harder. I'm not sure what it is.
Okay. That's a good
Here you
question.
consider classical scalar field on AdS and quantum stuff on what happens if you consider quantum scalar fields on AdS?
So, all right. So what I said originally is that there's a particular limit in which that description is valid, and quantum corrections in the bulk correspond to 1/n corrections in the field theory. The field theory is assumed to have a large number of fields or a large gate group.
Okay, so but here probably everything can be done explicitly. You shouldn't talk about quantum corrections. You can talk about full quantum theory.
Just for the scalar field?
So,
on the boundary or in the bulk?
No, on the bulk of anti-de Sitter space, I believe that quantum scalar quantum field theory, quantum scalar field theory is solvable.
Yeah, it's maximum symmetric, I would think so too.
So that, and I believe that you can look at the limits quite explicitly.
Yeah, but for the purposes of this talk, I think we're just gonna be happy with the classical.
Okay. Well, that's what the original paper does.
Yeah.
The original paper does study quantum fields and then studies the representations. If you take a quantum field on AdS, that's, yeah, you're right, that's solvable, and the representations are not. If you just take AdS,
yeah,
and that's how they get at the result, in fact. They really give the spectrum and show it's positive. That's certainly.
So it's okay. I have some reason to ask this. Later I will explain.
So, okay, in this really simple toy model for the scalar with a given mass, we just said that there are two possible dual operators with dimensions delta plus and delta minus, and what really selects the specific dimension of the operator, or in a fancier language, what determines the operator content in the dual field theory is the boundary conditions that you impose for the fields in the bulk. So let me draw your attention to the following fact. So if you select specific boundary conditions such that the operator has a dimension delta minus, I'll tell you in the next slide what those are, and you take the mass of the field to satisfy m squared greater than mbf squared plus 1, you have that delta minus is smaller than d over 2 minus 1, which is known from a field theory result that is unitarity bound in that theory. That means that if you have operators that violate that bound, you have a negative norm state. So from that point of view, and that's been known really early on in this AdS CFT business, that there's going to be something that goes wrong if you in the bulk if you do that, just because this bound exists and the two theories are supposed to be completely equivalent. So the question we're going to ask ourselves here, and what we ask ourselves with John Merrill, my advisor, and our latest paper, is what exactly goes wrong if you try to study this bulk scalar field with mass and boundary conditions that correspond to this unitarity bound violating operator and the field theory saying. So let me give you now the outline. What's the plan of action here? First, I'm going to discuss what's the setup, the correct setup to study a theory with an operator with that dimension from the holographic point of view. A key ingredient in the construction is to find appropriate inner product. Then, with that inner product, we're going to discuss the spectrum, compute the various norms of the modes, and look at the two-point function of the theory. Then we're going to consider what's from the point of view of the dual theory and IR deformation. I'll tell you in a second what that is. We're going to find, I don't want to give away the ending right away, so I'm just going to say that we're going to find a specific result, and then we're going to extend that result to other kinds of fields of other spins. Then we're going to discuss UV modification of those results. And finally, we're going to summarize and conclude the main results. So the setup is the simplest thing you can imagine doing. It's just a simple scalar field in AdS, just the usual bulk action for that. We're going to parameterize the mass in that way, and we're going to look at mu between 1 and 2. That corresponds to an operator that violates the unitarity bound. And the upper bound in 2 is just for simplicity. I'll tell you in a second why is that convenient. So the equations of motion around the line element that I just showed you tell you that the asymptotic expansion of the field, in which the boundary is located at r equals 0, has that form. And the coefficient phi1 is given in terms of phi2 by that algebraic equation. If you increase the values of nu, say you consider nu between 1 and 3, you get more terms in between phi naught and phi nu, which are the two independent fall-offs of the field. So,
just to be clear, if you, for instance, have a mass equal to the right motor mass, do you still violate the unitarity bound? So you go below.
No. If it's
okay,
exactly.
So it's only in that window.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if nu equals 0, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes, you can't. You don't violate the bound, and that theory is fine. So what we're going to do is, well, as I briefly mentioned, we have these two coefficients here, which are independent. So to have well-defined dynamics requires you to fix one or the other, or impose some boundary condition between those two. So we're going to focus on conformally invariant boundary conditions, and we're going to set this guy to 0. And which is in analogy with what you would call a Neumann boundary conditions. You're fixing this subleading guy. So what remains is this, which scales with r like this, and that tells you that the conformal dimension of that guy has to be delta minus, which is d over 2 minus mu. And since we're mu between 1 and 2, this theory from the holographic point of view violates the unitarity bound. So in order to have a well-defined setup, you need to construct an action that is finite and stationary with those boundary conditions. And the way to do that is to take your bulk action and supplement it with these boundary terms here. And let me emphasize the presence of this term here, which is, in some sense, a kinetic boundary term, right? It has the same form. Gamma is the induced metric on the boundary. It has the same form as this guy, but it has the opposite sign.
This is the guy that just depicts the variational principle?
Yeah. So if you have these boundary terms, the unshell variation of the action has this form, and is finite and stationary with the boundary conditions you imposed.
So you didn't change the equations in the bound. You
No.
changed the boundary conditions. What?
So I looked at the most general boundary condition that I have given the bulk equation, right? The equation is just the Klein-Gordon equation. And then I asked, well, what's the action that gives me those equations with the boundary conditions that I'm interested in? And in order to do that, you need to add this terms here. Any more questions? So, okay, let's look at this boundary kinetic term, and let me emphasize that it has the opposite sign of this bulk term. So that's usually a bad thing to do, right? When you have, say, just two kinetic terms with different signs in the bulk, you know that the theory is going to be sick in some sense. So here this suggests that something along those lines is going to happen, but, well, we need to analyze it in more detail because one is in the bulk, the other one's in the boundary, so it's unclear. But that already at this level suggests that something's going to go wrong. So key quantity in our construction is going to be a well-defined inner product that we're going to find. So usually the way you quantize, or the way you study, if you want, classical fields is by using the Klein-Gordon inner product, which is that quantity there. Well, if you're more familiar with the language of the symplectic structure, this is essentially the symplectic structure with some i's and complex conjugates. So this is a good inner product if nu is less than 1. If nu, for Neumann boundary conditions. If nu is greater than 1, this inner product diverges, and we need to modify it to have a well-defined product and Poisson bracket, and etc. So Don, Merolf, and Geoffroy Comper told us how to go with these kind of things. So if you have a well-defined action principle, like the one I showed you before, they gave a prescription of constructing a well-defined inner product based on that action. And essentially, this is just, well, think about the boundary counterterms as a theory in itself, compute that symplectic structure, and add that as a boundary term to the original product. So we had a kinetic term on the bulk that gives rise to this, and we have a kinetic term on the boundary with a precise coefficient that gives rise to this.
So is this a choice, or is it a kind of a unique thing? Because it feels like you're choosing what the quantum theory is now, right?
It's a choice, but it's a good choice in the sense that this inner product is finite and conserved. So yeah, there are...
But if there are other choices, you get other quantum theories.
So what other choices?
I mean, I'm asking
for the inner product.
Yeah. I mean, it changes the quantum theory, right?
But
because the inner product is going to give you probabilities, and if you use a different one,
right? Can you really do that, maintaining finiteness and conservation?
That's what I'm asking.
I don't think
this
so.
Is already this inner product is not specifically definite.
Exactly. So the original one is, but this one is not.
It's not specifically definite.
Right.
And that, if you omit the requirement for positive indefiniteness, then you will have enormous freedom for choosing.
So my guiding principle is to have something that is finite and conserved, and I don't think that you can modify that by preserving this property. So yeah, and you have to give up, as you point out, positivity, and that's exactly what suggests that something has to go wrong.
I mean, how are you going to get probabilities if you've already lost positivity now?
So exactly, after you construct this, you have to. It's not manifestly positive definite. I agree, but you have to compute the norms. I mean, we don't know. It might be.
So this is going to come now. That's the next.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going. So, as you were already aware, this is not manifestly positive definite, and the pathology that we expect in the bulk is that we're going to have ghosts. What is a ghost? Is essentially a solution or a field that has a positive frequency but a negative norm, and that has several problems associated to it. Like classically, the energy is unbounded below. If you try to quantize a theory, you're going to have states with negative norms, etc., etc. So, what's the name of the game? We need to find the spectrum, compute the norms, and particularly look for ghosts. And we're also going to mention what happens in the Dirichlet case or the new less than one case to compare both cases and why one is fine and the other one is not. So we're just going to look for solutions of that form. We're going to introduce the concept of the boundary mass, which is simply the value of the Casimir of the boundary Laplacian. And in terms of that quantity, we can classify the spectrum. And
is that a good quantity? Because isn't the boundary meant to be a conformal field theory, but now it has a mass?
Well, the spectrum is going to be continuous, so it's fine.
Oh, well. So you said this is the eigenvalue of the Laplacian on the boundary. You use that.
Yeah, just mass is
so
maybe
that,
a bad
that
name.
operator will be invariant somehow. So.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not going to call it mass, I'll call it m.
Okay.
So for m squared positive, you have the usual Bessel functions that are plane wave normalizable at the Poincare horizon, and you calculate the norms of the various modes, and you find that for Dirichlet and Neumann boundary conditions, that all the norms are positive, even if mu is greater than 1. And that came as a surprise because, as we just noticed, the inner product is not manifestly positive definite. So there's something strange going on here. So for m squared less than 0, the boundary conditions rule out the modes. We don't have any tachyons in this simple theory. But for m squared equals 0, the modes are just this power law. And we found that for Neumann boundary conditions, these guys become normalizable when mu is greater than 1, as opposed to when mu is less than 1, in which they are ruled out from the spectrum. And moreover, they are pure gauge. What does that mean? That they are null directions of the symplectic structure. So they are spurious states.
What's the gauge here? You don't have a gauge theory.
So the way I'm defining a gauge mode is a null direction of the symplectic structure, or something that has 0 inner product with everything else.
So there must have been a gauge symmetry somewhere.
So really, called pure gauge is simply what appears when you go to really symplectic. You probably have three symplectic structure here.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you go to, and then you should go to symplectic structure, characterizing with respect to something you call gauge.
Right, but it's exactly, yes, it's an abuse of notation to call that symplectic structure because you don't know if you're going to have gauge modes or not. But the appearance of this mode came as a surprise to us because it's a scalar theory. I mean, what the gauge symmetry could be.
If the two form is degenerate, then it should be.
I completely agree with you, but it's not clear to me from the beginning. I mean, if you just give me the theory and say, well, this is the mass of your scalar field, there's no obvious symmetry transformation at the level of the Lagrangian that tells you that.
If your kinetic term has some 0 directions, I mean, that's what you usually call a symmetry, so there must be.
When you combine both the boundary and the bulk.
Somewhere there's a gauge symmetry hidden.
Definitely, it's there from the definition of the. Well, it's a null direction of the symplectic structure. I agree with you, but it's not obvious from the beginning that it's going to be there.
Are you going to later on follow it back and work out what the gauge symmetry is, or?
I'm going to do something slightly different, but this is going to play an important role. So we were expecting ghosts for new greater than 1 and Neumann boundary conditions, but all the norms, well, the norm is not positive definite, but we didn't find negative norms. So there's got to be a problem, right? Because from the boundary point of view, we know that unitarity is lost, but from the bulk, we didn't find such a thing.
You say don't find, are you saying you ruled them out, or that you just, for the cases you looked at, you didn't find them?
For solutions of that form.
Right. So it says something about the boundary modes, because you had to see the IKX, I guess.
Right.
But maybe, you know, if you have a compact boundary or something, you could really pin down the boundary spectrum and make that.
So you're talking about global AdS.
No, I'm worried about, so you made a certain ansatz, and in that ansatz you don't find negative norms.
Right.
But maybe outside of the ansatz there's some negative norms.
That's a possibility. I can't claim that this is a complete spectrum.
But if you put in a complete set of boundary states, which you may be able to argue that the IKX is, then maybe the ansatz is alright. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Sorry, you're trying to argue that this basis is complete, or that's...
I'm just wondering whether one can,
Yeah. So, well, but with the information we just have on this slide, we can get at least the physics right. So, and what's going on here is that the operator that is defined by this bulk field, since there's that gauge mode floating around, the operator is not gauge invariant, and then the unitarity bound does not apply. The unitarity bound only applies for physical states, which are gauge invariant in particular. So there's no contradiction with AdS CFT. What we're doing here, and let me take a deeper look through the theory, looking at the 2-point function. That's what we're going to do next, because we find something strange. Let's try to understand a little better what's going on. So this is just the usual field theory calculation. We're going to mod out by the gauge modes. We're going to expand the field in terms of creation and annihilation operators. This is the symplectic structure we found before. I didn't tell you what the explicit expression was, but it's this. It just follows from conformal invariance. You get a delta function in the momentum, some positive constant, which is 4 to the new gamma, some gamma functions. It's not important what it is. And we get m to the 2 nu. That just follows from conformal invariance. So in terms of that quantity, we can calculate the commutator between A and A dagger, right? And we plug in this in the expectation value. We write the expectation value in terms of the commutator, and then we use that result, and we get that expression. And so yeah, this is just the inverse of that, and as a result, you get omega squared minus k squared in the denominator, right? And this expression diverges because these are time-lag modes, and you have to compute this integral for omega greater than k. So what's going on here is that this theory is actually gravely sick because the 2-point function is ill-defined.
But this is only in your theory. If you take standard stuff, then standard
quantum field theory in curved spaces.
You have no problem.
Sorry.
You have no problem with this 2-point function in other regions. Only
in other gauges? No.
So if you consider the special region, you have already a problem. If these problems, my question is, what happens with this 2-point function in this more standard regions?
Oh, for the mass?
Right.
Yeah, it's fine.
Everything is
yeah, so for Dirichlet boundary conditions, you get this with a minus here, and then this is upstairs instead of downstairs. That's fine. If nu is still, if you're still in the Neumann theory, but nu is less than 1, this integral is convergent.
So there is one more question about maybe about everything is fine. So really, to have this good interpretation of all this stuff, you need a kind of asymptotic commutativity. You need this two-point function go to 0, not only defining, but go to 0 when you move in spatial direction. Does it go to 0?
It diverges. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it doesn't go to 0 at large separations.
So, excuse me.
But you could do the limit, do the integration later, and then first take the limit that things are separated.
Maybe we should talk about the stuff of that theory.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to argue that the theory is already sick. So there are problems in at various places. So I mean, I didn't think about all the reasons why it could be wrong, but I think this is conclusive enough to see what the problem is. So yes, we just discussed before, it diverges in that region, which is the IR in some sense, is the small momentum limit, and then one can say that the theory just doesn't exist. So, well, but we still didn't find negative norm states, and we know a simple way to modify the IR behavior of these theories, and that's what we're going to do now. So, if you have a theory with a photon, you also have IR divergences, right? How do you cure those IR divergences? A quiz. I'm just giving you a quiz. What do you do?
You sum over soft photons.
Or you can add
a
a mass as a regulator first, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do, and a mass is nothing but an IR relevant term. So from the CFT point of view, that's what we're doing here. We had the generating function, which is identified with the action, and we're just going to add to that terms that are relevant in the IR. We have what essentially is a boundary mass term and a boundary kinetic term. And the AdS CFT dictionary tells you that that is dual from the bulk point of view to modifying the boundary conditions. And we can immediately see that from just that equation. That's because if you demand that action to be finite and stationary, you notice that that's the boundary conditions. That's the boundary condition that you need to satisfy. And what's interesting is that the constants kappa and lambda need to be dimensionful, right? For this equation to make sense and for this equation to make sense. So since they are dimensionful, they break conformal invariance, and the theory RG flows to the IR to the delta plus theory. That's what's going on here. And as a result, if you go and compute the simplicity structure, now you're going to find that the small m limit corresponds to the Dirichlet theory, and that's fine. So the 2-point function for the, if you just restrict on the light-like modes, that's fine. But yeah, so this solves the IR problem. But now you do find the ghosts. So by introducing these modifications that fix the IR problem, then the ghosts come in from the back door. So yeah, then you have other extra. Now you have tachyonic states that were ruled out before by the boundary conditions. But with these new boundary conditions, you do have these tachyonic modes, and if you go on and compute their norms, you find negative norm states.
You broke the gauge invariance that you found before.
Yeah. In some cases, I think if you set lambda to 0, the light-like modes are still there. The Gibbs modes remain.
But you still have the tagging.
You still have the tokens. Yeah.
Maybe you need a gauge invariant regulator. Or you need to ask whether one exists.
Yeah, so we have a way to get rid of the ghost by doing something that's perhaps more like a brute force procedure. I'll tell you in a second what we're thinking about. So, how am I doing with time? Am I going too fast?
Well, you've got another 10, 12 minutes, 15 minutes, I'd say, because you started late.
Okay.
You can't go too fast. There's no too fast.
There's no too fast? Yeah, you guys have to stop me if I'm going too fast. Are there more questions, by the way? No? Okay, so that's the basic setup that we discussed recently for the scalar field, but you can extend this result to other theories with analog Neumann boundary conditions. So, and we find that those are pathological for scalar in global AdS. If you do the same calculation in global AdS, then the spectrum is discrete, and you find the ghost right away, even for the undeformed theory. You also have ghosts that are close to the light cone, the approximate light cone that you have in that setup. So, if you look at Maxwell fields and odd dimensions, you find that the 2-point function is still defined, as I just showed you before, and even dimensions, you find ghosts.
That's odd bulk dimensions, right? Or odd
boundary dimensions.
So these your boundary dimensions.
Yeah. Small d is the boundary dimension.
Right. So abstractions from the boundary are normally meant to be for odd bulk. Yeah. Probably fits.
Yeah. So for even d, you have the anomalies and the logs,
Yeah.
and that breaks from formal
That's right.
invariance,
That's right.
and then you do see the ghosts. The only exception is in AdS4, which is in some sense analog to a scalar field in the Brighton-Lerner-Friedman window, that is mbf squared and mbf squared plus 1. Then both boundary conditions are right. That's the analog of that for Maxwell fields. If you then look at gravitons, you find problems for all d. There are no exceptions here, but the same structure remains that for all d, for odd d, the 2-point function is still defined. For even d, you have ghosts, and that was previously analyzed by Compare and Merolf. If you look at Maxwell-Chern-Simons theory in AdS3, you find ghosts even when the usual bulk symplectic structure is well defined. Even if you don't add these counterterms, then the original symplectic structure of the theory was not positive definite, and that's work with Juan Codad and Rob League. And if you can consider also CFTs and spaces which are not the plane, which is what we were looking at, or the cylinder as in global AdS, but you can put the CFT to live in the Sitter or in AdS by foliating the AdS d plus 1 using a different foliation, say a foliation in the Sitter slices or a foliation in terms of AdS slices. And if you do that and look at nu greater than 1, you also find the ghosts. Let's work with Christoph Uhlemann. So here's the question that Andrew was asking: what can we do to get rid of these ghosts? So this is work in progress with Tom Faulkner and Don Merolf. So what we thought originally is that the ghosts were in some sense an IR effect because they were manifesting as through this strange behavior of the 2-point function. So we added an IR deformation, but that doesn't get rid of the ghosts, right? That actually introduces the ghost. So let's see if we can do something in the UV to kill the ghosts. And what we're going to do is to consider what can be interpreted as a UV cutoff. So from this point of view, from the holographic point of view, the radial direction is interpreted as an energy direction. So instead of considering the full AdS space, we're going to go just put a wall at a finite distance from the boundary. And that's a simple toy model for a physical UV cutoff that can be provided by, say, what are those called? A domain wall, which you have a solution that interpolates between two regimes. And just to model that in a simple way, you can just put a wall at some distance from the boundary. The simplest way to do that in a way that connects continuously to the theory without the cutoff is just write down the same kind of action and rescale the fields, and now say that we'll declare that the boundary, instead of being at r equals 0, is at r equals r naught. And you can study this theory in the same way that we studied the previous one, compute the norms, etc., etc. And you find the following phase diagram structure. So for kappa greater than some critical value, for any value of lambda, you find that the theory goes free. If lambda is less than 0, you have the tachyon, that is not a ghost. But if lambda is positive and kappa is greater than this critical value, you only have time-like excitations. So this is, in some sense, a UV completion of the theory we had before, but you need to introduce a cutoff. That's the price you need to pay, and that, of course, conformal invariance has been broken.
What do you mean by time-like excitation?
Oh, m squared, m boundary squared greater than 0. Time-like from the...
So, so no like guys. You mean nothing like?
Nothing tachyonic or like. Yeah. Yeah, I think... Let me be more precise. I think if you are exactly at lambda equals 0, you still have these like creatures. So yeah. I think you also need lambda to be epsilon above 0.
Well, presumably, as you go across these lines, one type you should get to actually follow the excitations through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And they'll turn from being a regular physical one to light.
That's exactly what happens. You can follow the excitations through the lines.
That's exactly.
Yeah. And well, what's most important that the ghosts are in this region. So let's, well, I think we have a couple more minutes, but I'm just going to summarize unless there are more questions. No? Okay, so we found what specifically happens in the bulk when you violate the unitarity bound in the boundary theory. We found that they are indeed pathological, as was expected from the boundary point of view. But what's interesting is that the specific way that the pathologies manifest themselves in the bulk depends on the space in which the dual CFT lives. To be more precise, well, in the Poincaré patch, where the theory lives on the plane, we didn't find the ghost, but we found this strange extra gauge mode. But if the theory lives on the cylinder, in the case of global AdS, then you do see the ghost in the bulk theory. If the boundary theory lives on AdS or DS, you also see explicitly the ghost in the bulk. So by this, and the last slide, I just mentioned that it seems to be possible to rule out this ghost by just putting a UV wall cut off, but it would be interesting.
CFT, yeah?
Hmm?
Then we kill CFT.
Yeah, absolutely. So AdS CFT is started as a duality between pure AdS and conformal field theory, but shortly after people were interested in modifying and breaking various symmetries. So yeah, it's true. So I think as a future direction, it would be interesting to find a physical realization of this cutoff that I presented at the end by constructing a domain wall solution in this context and see how the ghosts disappear in this more physical setup. So yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Questions?
So I don't have any questions to the talk, but I have a question to especially to experts in AdS CFT.
Okay.
So let me formulate this question. So really, so some moment in my life I have written a paper when I tried to convince people that really locality is not quite important thing. What is important is asymptotic commutativity with respect to spatial translations. And so let us look at AdS theory from this viewpoint. So this, first of all, the question is, what is the dimension of this theory? AdS 5. The dimension is 5. No. From the viewpoint of this theory, the dimension isn't 5. The dimension is at most 4. Because to create quantum mechanics, you need a billion the algebra, a billion group of symmetries. The maximal dimension of a billion part of conformal group is 4. So therefore the theory is at most 4 dimensional. Now, what should you do to apply the technique that I have applied? You should have asymptotic commutativity. And this is very easy to check in your business. So really, you calculated this 2-point function. This 2-point functions in good situation are well defined. And you can do the following thing. You can, so you have here x, t, x prime, t prime, whatever. I don't what are your notations. But in any case, you can consider the case when the second point is obtained from the first point by means of spatial translation. And the question is, do you have a asymptotic commutativity in this case?
So
because if it is, then you can apply the general theory if you have.
So you're just asking about 2 points that are anywhere in the bulk.
Anywhere in the bulk, what is anywhere? Not anywhere. So you have in this conformal group that governs both AdS and CFT, you have 4-dimensional abelian subgroup. It is not quite simple, but to write it down explicitly, but not very difficult also. And the question is, so you have 1 point, you apply this.
Sorry, is it spatial or spatial?
Spatial, coming from space.
Okay.
So really, this is so you have this.
And you're asking if the 2-point function decays as you separate the points apart.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should.
That's very easy question.
Well, he has a local quantum field
So-
theory. He has a local
Yeah.
quantum field theory on the boundary.
Okay. So the boundary I do not know anything. I'm talking about AdS. But my statement is that four-dimensional theory already lives on AdS 5. You shouldn't go to the bottom. So this is the state.
But isn't it if he really believes?
So?
Isn't it that if he really believes his theory reproduces his four-dimensional quantum field theory, that the correlation functions of the four-dimensional one, which is a local quantum field theory, in a non-local way?
So the question is, so another way to formulate this conjecture is as follows: that if you have this correlation that I explained, when your spatial translation goes to infinity, then this correlation should be related to the correlations on the boundary. But this is,
In principle, it sounds very, very close, right? The two pictures sound very close.
so anyway, this very simple question that probably can be answered by any person that is looking at this direction. If it is, if the answer is positive, and maybe it is, then you simply can forget about this Balkan boundary, work about, and consider it as four-dimensional theory.
Yeah, well, I think that's in the spirit of the conjecture, right? That the two theories are exactly the same thing, and you shouldn't really make a distinction between. So the discussion whether it's four-dimensional or five-dimensional becomes unimportant once you declare or prove in principle that they are actually the same thing. I agree with you.
In some sense, it would be a proof of the CFT in the simple case. It's usually the more complicated cases. It's much more complicated, and I don't know how to calculate.
So the full duality includes gravity as well in the bulk. The full AdS CFT comes with gravity in the bulk. So
that's I do not want to discuss, even to discuss. It comes in with gravity, it comes with strings here.
right, yeah.
So that then you can ask the same question, but it's difficult to answer.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
So I think I have to cut the discussion off because there's a domain wall of, I think it's KP solitons about to end.
Okay.
Let's thank the speaker once
Well,
more.
thank you so much. on the title. So we have the bulk physics in AdS in anti-de Sitter space, and this dual conformal field theory is supposed to live on the boundary of the CFT, on the boundary of the gravitational field. So what's really impressive about this, one of the most impressive aspects, is that in some particular limit, the bulk physics are classical physics, whereas the theory that lives on the boundary is a quantum field theory. So this is a little bit of a demagogical phrase that Einstein's equations know about quantum field theory. That's something that, at least to me, sounds really tantalizing. So let's see a little bit in more detail how this might be even possible. So let's look at the symmetries in both sides of the duality. So that's the anti-de Sitter line element. It has that form. And you can see that the isometry group of that metric corresponds to the global symmetry group of conformal field theory, which is the group SOD(2). So at the level of the symmetries, at least at the very, very basic level, this seems to at least make sense. So yeah, this I need to say that this remains as a conjecture, although it's been tested. And
Ice cream.
yeah,
So,
it's going to be busy for a while. So
yeah.
start.
So I'll introduce you. So it's a pleasure to have Thomas here. Representative Barbara is going to tell us about unitarity bounds in AdS CFT.
Well, yeah, the pleasure is actually mine. I'd like to thank the organizers and Andrew in particular for giving me the opportunity to be here. So yeah, I'll be talking about some work that I've been doing with, well, primarily John Merrill. That's the original reference. And other follow-ups with other people, Tom Faulkner, Juan Cotard, Rob League, and Christoph Ullmann. So me start with a brief introduction of what AdS CFT is. Just 2 slides of this material. So this is a really broad term that it's well, it's been used since '98 to talk about the correspondence between 2 different, seemingly completely different creatures. So we have on one side of the duality, we have gravitational theories in anti-de Sitter space. That's the AdS part. And on the other side of the duality, we have conformal field theories. And AdS CFT states that these 2 beasts are actually equivalent. So we'll see how does that go in a more precise way later on, but I just wanted to state that that's the main idea, and just to explain a little bit what's going on. It's passed all the tests so far, and at least to me and to some other people in the community, this is becoming more like a toolbox to understand aspects of quantum field theory using gravitation and vice versa. So what is incredible about this is that we can actually have a precise map or a dictionary, that's the jargon that people use to refer to this, between various objects in each side of the duality. And I think one neat way of putting that in just one equation is that the equation that I wrote there. So we have on the right-hand side the generating function for some operator computed in the conformal field theory, and in some particular limit that is equal to simply the on-shell action evaluated for some boundary condition on the gravitational side. So there's a map between fields in the gravitational side with operators, and a more precise way to say that is that the boundary conditions in the bulk correspond to sources of certain operators that live on the CFT side. So let's look at the simplest possible example. If we have a scale.
Is there a rigorous proof for that, or is it just a level of looking at the positivity of terms in the action? The original proof is representation theoretically. Just check the spectrum.
Yeah, and you need the entire solution to see what the spectrum looks like.
If you had a generally curved space, albeit asymptotically AdS, calculating the spectrum might be hard.
So I think if you think about it in terms of the field theory, the conformal dimensions only depend on the asymptotics, right? So, and if you just demand that the dimensions are real,
right? So then
you get a bound like that.
That much you'll still find the bound, but there's a statement that the energy is bounded below. That's a stronger statement than just saying that
It
this
is.
particular quantity is real.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what would happen if you have a CFT or a deformed CFT with imaginary or complex conformal dimensions. Something has to go wrong, I would say.
Well, no, I'm just asking about a bulk which was generally
Mhm.
curved but asymptotically AdS.
Is the energy...
Is there an energy theorem that can be proved? Positivity energy theorem. But
for all asymptotically AdS?
yeah.
I would assume so, but I'm not aware of the paper.
I think it would be much harder. I'm not sure.
Scalar field in AdS with some given mass, there are in principle two dual operators which this field can correspond to in the CFT, and the conformal dimensions are given by that formula in terms of the mass. Note that there's this quantity called m squared BF, that's the Brighton-Dorner-Friedland mass. And it's been known since the 80s that tachyonic masses in AdS are allowed as long as they are not smaller than that value. So this is a really curious geometry which allows you to have negative square masses and the theory is still stable. Well, that's what I just
So
said.
the proofs for generally curved spaces, still Einstein. So this is just flat, conformally flat AdS.
Sorry.
Yeah, but suppose you put a massive theory in a space with a cosmological constant, which was not a maximally symmetric space like this AdS. Then are there versions of the stability proof for that case? Because the original paper was just for when it was really conformally flat.
So I think this holds for any asymptotically AdS space.